Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to this fourth online Bible study. We're still in the book of Acts. Today we're looking at chapters 17 and 18 in the book of Acts. First of all, I'd like to ask for some of your feedback. If you have ideas for future Bible studies, including possibly an online component of the Bible study, send me an email, let me know, send me a text, mention something to me at church or whatever. But I'd like to hear your ideas. One of the ideas that I've kind of toyed with in my mind is for the upcoming year, 2016. I know in the past, at least at Midway, I've kind of experimented with inviting the congregation to read through the whole Bible in one year. That kind of fizzled after a couple months. The last time I tried it, may have been biting off a little more than I could chew. I did think about, though, perhaps for the year 2016, maybe we could read the whole New Testament together, and it would amount to basically about one chapter a day. We could meet once a week to discuss the passages of Scripture that we had read for that week. I could do this little online component to summarize some of our readings and reflections for the day's readings. Anyway, that's kind of an idea that I had. Maybe might appeal to some of you reading the entire New Testament in the year 2016. Let me know if that sounds appealing to you. In the meantime, we're going to be looking today at the book of Acts, chapters 17 and 18. At the beginning of chapter 17, we're continuing to look at the story of the life of Paul. The beginning of 17, he is in a town called Thessalonica, and he is preaching there. He is gaining some traction with the folks. Some Jewish people are coming to faith. Some Gentile believers are coming to faith. Luke tells us at the beginning of chapter 17 that also some prominent women leaders were accepting the Christian faith and being baptized into the church. Paul and Silas were preaching there in the synagogues, and though they were not popular with everybody, I'm going to begin reading with verse 4 of chapter 17. Some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks and not a few of the leading women. But the Jews became jealous, and with the help of some ruffians in the marketplace, they formed a mob and set the city in an uproar. While they were searching for Paul and Silas to bring them out to the assembly, they attacked Jason's house. When they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some believers before the city authorities, shouting, "These people who have been turning the world upside down have come here also, and Jason has entertained them as guests. They are acting contrary to the decrees of the emperor, saying that there is another king named Jesus." The people and the city officials were disturbed when they heard this, and after they had taken bail from Jason and the others, they let them go. So Jason was apparently a believer who had extended hospitality to Paul and Silas. And interestingly enough, their beliefs in Jesus and their proclamation of Jesus as the Messiah, and remember, Messiah simply means one who is anointed. A Messiah was one who was anointed as king by God to rule. And when they proclaimed this faith, they ran into conflict with the Roman authorities. They were at least accusing the early Christians of believing in another king named Jesus, whom they held in higher regard than Caesar. So at several times in the book of Acts, there are these statements that Luke gives us that Jesus came into conflict with people for their political beliefs in Caesar. Indeed, in the first century, the most common way that Romans had of pledging their allegiance to Caesar was to say that Caesar is Lord. And Christians, of course, maintained that Jesus was Lord. And this was the source of a lot of conflict with the early Christian movement in the Roman Empire. I do want to call your attention to one thing about that passage that I read, and you will see, you may have noticed that Luke says, in verse 5 of chapter 17, "But the Jews became jealous, and with the help of some ruffians in the marketplace, they formed a mob, and thus set the city in an uproar." And Luke, the author of Acts, seems to single out the Jews in this circumstance. Now, he doesn't mean, though, that all Jews were like this. Indeed, most of the earliest Christians were Jews. He was just saying that the particular Jewish leaders of that day and that time and that place were opposed to the Jesus movement, the proclamation of the gospel. Not all Jews. And this certainly, there's passages like this in the New Testament have been used in the history of the church to excuse some forms of anti-Semitism. And the worst parts of that came in the Holocaust in Nazi Germany, in which they even used some passages of the New Testament to paint Jews as particularly opposed to the gospel or demonic. That's a terrible misuse of the scriptures if they are ever used for anti-Semitic purposes. But sometimes they have been, and Christians just need to be aware that in places like this, when Luke is talking about the Jews, he's not talking about all Jews for all times and all places, just the particular Jewish people there who were in positions of leadership who were opposed to the Christian faith. Actually, we read later on in chapter 17 and chapter 18 about some leaders of the synagogues in some of the places where Paul preached who actually accepted the Christian faith and became Christians themselves and became early Christian leaders. So it's certainly not the case that all Jews everywhere were opposed to the ministry of Paul and Silas, because many of them supported the ministry of Paul and Silas. After Paul and Silas were kind of run out of Thessalonica, they went to a town called Berea. There they preached the faith. And this crowd of characters from Thessalonica who had run Paul out of Thessalonica, they heard that Paul was now preaching in Berea, and they left Thessalonica, followed him to Berea, and opposed him in Berea too, and said to the Bereans, "Look, you really don't want to mess with this guy Paul. Don't give him any hospitality. Don't give him a hearing." So they were so opposed to Paul that they not only opposed him in their hometown of Thessalonica, they followed him to Berea and opposed him there too. They were dead set against Paul and the Christians there. So Paul and Silas, after they had spent some time in Berea, actually Paul left Silas and Timothy there, and Paul went on to Athens. And there we get the famous speech of Paul there in the marketplace in Athens on Mars Hill, in which Paul says, Luke had already told us that Paul was very distressed over all the idols that he had seen in the city of Athens. But the people of Athens were used to sitting around all day listening to different philosophers, different teachers come and proclaim their different messages. They had plenty of time apparently on their hands to just listen to different people passing through. And they assumed that Paul was just another teacher, another philosopher who was coming through, had a special message, and they listened to Paul too, like they listened to anybody traveling through. But Paul began his speech in Athens by saying these words. He said, "Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, he who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. From one ancestor he made all nations to inhabit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said." So here Paul, when he's beginning his speech in Athens, he's beginning with a point of contact with the Athenians. He's saying, look, I've seen how religious you are, and you even have an altar to an unknown God. And so there must be something within you Athenians that knows that there's something more that you're missing. You even recognize this in your shrine. You set up this shrine to an unknown God. And I am here to tell you that the one you don't know about, the one you haven't heard about yet, he's real. And he doesn't live in man-made temples, but he is real. And Paul goes on to say that he makes some more points of contact with the Athenian people. He quotes some of their poets, some of their philosophers from the past. Some of them knew that in God that we live and move and have our being. And another poet is quoted, "For we too are his offspring." Now, when the pagan poets were writing those things, they were actually writing about Zeus when they wrote those things. But Paul was using the little bit of knowledge that they knew and saying, you know some things on your own intuition, but I'm here to tell you even more about the truth of the gospel. And he ends his little speech at Athens with these words. While God has overlooked the times of human ignorance, now he commands all people everywhere to repent. He's talking about repenting of their idolatry, of their worship of all these idols that they have set up in the marketplace. Because he has fixed a day on which he will have the world judged in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. So although Paul starts with some of the things they might have in common, he finishes his powerful sermon in a dramatic way by pointing to the resurrection of Christ. Now, they may have known some things about God from their pagan mythology, but they certainly did not accept, for the most part, Paul's message about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It says there that there were a couple of people in Athens who accepted the gospel, but for the most part, the Athenians just said, we'll listen to you again some other day. And they basically put him off. But Paul left there as soon as that little speech was over and went on to a town called Corinth. Now, we have lots of letters in the New Testament about Paul writing to different people, different churches that he had established throughout the Mediterranean world. We don't have a letter that Paul ever wrote to the church in Athens. So it's doubtful that there ever was much of a church in Athens. So his strategy of identifying with them in order to point them towards the gospel, we don't have any evidence that met with great success. We do read that there were a couple of converts in Athens. And hey, if a couple of people believe, then it's all been worth it. Paul leaves there in chapter 18 and goes to Corinth. Corinth was a very densely populated city. It was a seaport on both sides of the sea. It was like an isthmus. It had water on both sides, so a lot of trade going on. Corinth was a huge city. Athens was only a city of about 20,000 people at the time. Corinth was a city of about 250,000 people at the time. Again, lots of trade. We read there, we know based on Paul's correspondence with the church at Corinth later on, that there were lots of divisions in the church at Corinth. There was sexual immorality. There were other problems in the church at Corinth. But Paul wrote them a letter later saying, put away your divisions, focus on love. In 1 Corinthians 13, it says you can have all kinds of faith, but if you don't have love, you're just a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. So Paul later wrote to these Corinthians and encouraged them to love one another despite their differences. He did want them to hold fast to the gospel which he had proclaimed to them when he was in Corinth. He spent a year and a half in Corinth. There in Corinth, he met and befriended Prisca and Aquila, who were a husband and wife, who were his co-workers in the gospel, who helped him as he was in Corinth. He was a tent maker in Corinth. He earned a living and established lots of roots there in Corinth in the year and a half that he served in ministry there. And that's probably why we have letters about Paul's missionary activity in Corinth. That's all I got time for today. God bless, and I hope to see you next week.